Well, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to this, the last of our series of winter pensions webinars. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Patten from Field Fisher, and I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Grant Suckling of Ross Trustees. You'll both be able to see us for the moment, and then we'll switch on to slides only. The subject of our webinar this morning is governance and 21st century trusteeship, an area where the pensions regulator has been pushing to raise standards for some time. And in my experience, the last 12 months have certainly been an interesting proving ground for many schemes. Some have proved to be quite flexible and resilient and able to cope with new circumstances and new ways of doing things. But for some, it has definitely exposed some shortcomings. And I think it's fair to say that all schemes have identified areas where things can be done better. Now, before I get into the meat of the seminar, there are a couple of housekeeping points that I just wanted to flag up for you. If you do have any questions, what you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen is a question or chat box in your control panel. And we'll aim to get through as many questions as possible at the end of the session. But if we don't get time to go through everybody's questions, Grant and myself will aim to follow up with you individually to answer those questions. Also, if you have any technical issues, you can use that same drop-down box to talk to a member of our technical team, but hopefully everything will be okay. And finally, if your colleague would like to have the benefit of our webinar again, it will be available on the Field Fisher YouTube channel together with our previous webinars. So I'll get into the meat of our talk now and share my screen with you. So before we get into detail, I think it's actually worth taking a step back and considering what it is we mean when we talk about governance and consider why it's important. I think it can often be something of a nebulous concept for many, and a word that produces a bit of an internal groan, to be quite frank. But it's also true that not giving it due care and attention can lead to things coming seriously unstuck. And what I like to liken governance to is really the skeleton of your scheme. And without it, things are going to become distinctly wobbly. At its heart, governance really is quite a simple concept. In the pensions world, it's about how you manage your scheme. Good governance is about having structures and processes in place which enable trustees to set objectives and make and implement informed decisions to achieve those objectives in an effective, timely, and transparent way. And really, ultimately, good governance should be aimed at delivering a good experience for members and a good outcome for them too. Successful governance arrangements are all founded on certain key principles, but with their precise nature tailored to meet a scheme's particular circumstances and also trustees' preferred ways of doing things. It's also true that they require frequent review and adjustment to reflect changes in legal and regulatory requirements, and I'll mention some of those a bit later, and also trustees and scheme circumstances. And also, don't forget the scheme employer and others involved in scheme. Governance arrangements also need to be adaptable and reflect their circumstances too. Sorry, my slides appear to have stuck. There we go. So what are the legal and regulatory requirements applying to pension schemes regarding governance? And here what I'm going to focus on are private sector trust-based schemes, which are master trusts. Well, these flow from a number of sources. The Pensions Act 2004 is the starting point. It lays down a requirement for trustees to have an effective system of governance, including having arrangements and procedures in place for the administration and management of the scheme and safe custody of the scheme's assets. The Act recognises that this isn't a one-fits-all requirement, though, and says that governance should be appropriate to the size, nature, scale, and complexity of the scheme. So an open, underfunded, multi-billion-pound scheme with a large number of investments, multiple benefit categories, and an overseas sponsor is going to need a much more involved governance structure than a closed, well-funded scheme with far fewer assets, and just a simple one category of members. It's also not just pensions law that imposes governance obligations on trustees. For example, data protection legislation requires trustees to put measures and policies in place to ensure members' personal data is processed in accordance with legal requirements. And again, what trustees put in place will depend on the nature and risks relating to their processing and what is proportionate. Governance is also something which is expanding. As some of you may know, at the moment, new regulations are being consulted on, which will introduce new requirements for trustees of large schemes to put governance arrangements in place to enable them to identify and monitor climate change risks and opportunities which apply to their scheme. So those are going to be schemes from this October that have £5 billion or more of assets, and from next October, £1 billion or more. So what this demonstrates is that to have an effective system of governance, trustees, with help from their advisors, need to have a deep understanding of their duties and powers flowing from trust, pensions, and other laws, also their particular scheme rules and guidance issued by regulatory and industry bodies. And they need to keep on top of developments, such as those I mentioned relating to climate change, to enable their systems to remain fit for purpose and to address key risks. A key element of good governance is that those involved with the pension scheme, and especially the trustee board, knows who is responsible for what. It sounds very obvious, but often I think it's not always clear as it can be. COVID has highlighted the importance of documenting these roles and responsibilities, as people can become suddenly unavailable with someone having to step into the breach. Another benefit of documenting things is that it makes it much easier for new trustees and advisors to come on board and understand from an early stage how the scheme works. So what I'd recommend is the following 3 steps. Firstly, have a clear description of the trustee's obligations and the decisions and the actions needed to run the scheme. Secondly, have details of who in practice is responsible for making, implementing and overseeing decisions, and also who needs to be consulted or informed about decisions. And thirdly, have a framework of clear and practical policies, matters such as things like dealing with conflicts of interest, trustee training requirements for your particular scheme, and how to deal with common benefit issues. So, for example, the payment of death and ill health benefits, and also the approach to tracing missing members. And these should be reviewed ideally annually, with changes being made to reflect any lessons learned over the previous years. Effective governance should also allow a trustee board to focus on determining the scheme's key objectives and the strategy for achieving them and other important issues. And for most schemes, this will involve the board delegating responsibilities to trustee committees and third parties, such as the scheme's administrator. And all trustees should be familiar with and have ready access to the scheme's governance documents, including the scheme's trust deed and rules, the business plan, committee terms of reference, and things such as key contracts, such as those for the scheme administrator. And what I particularly find most helpful is for those schemes where all key documents are available to advisors and trustees through an online secure portal, so they're always there for people to look at whenever they need. Another key aspect of good governance is effective decision making. And this, I'd say, is important at all levels. So not just at the trustee board level, but trustee committees, scheme service providers, and also at the sponsoring employer level. All these decisions need to be effective if the scheme is going to work properly. Clear and comprehensive policies, processes, terms of reference will help ensure timely, effective, and importantly, robust decisions. And it's also helpful to test these documents, these policies, to see if they work well in all circumstances. So really give them a good stress test if that's something you can possibly do. Planning and preparation is also key. In well-run schemes, what I tend to see is the chair of trustees will be the service providers and advisors to set meeting agendas and taking into account the scheme's business plan and strategic and other key issues. And to facilitate effective decision making, business plans should really factor in the need for training and advice. And a rolling 12 or possibly better 18-month plan is generally helpful to manage this. Trustees should also have plenty of time to consider agenda items and papers in advance of meetings, so they can be well prepared to discuss matters. Clearly, there will be circumstances where urgent decisions and less notice is going to be possible, but really weeks is the time period where most papers should be available to trustees. And for some schemes, I think that is a challenge to good governance, where often advisor papers are delivered late and don't help inform good decisions. At meetings, it's helpful if the trustees facilitate the input of all trustees, ensure that matters are fully discussed, advice understood, and as appropriate challenged and decisions reached. It can also be a helpful discipline at the beginning of the meeting for the trustee chair to summarise the key objectives of the meeting, and at the end consider if these have been achieved. As I mentioned at the beginning, to be able to run a scheme properly, the trustee board will need to set clear objectives, focusing on key issues. And these matters will include scheme funding levels and assumptions, employer covenant and security for funding, and investment strategy, including performance and risk benchmarks. The pension regulator recommends that trustees take a holistic approach to matters and also set objectives and strategies covering various timeframes. And the trustees should also not forget to include administration and member service in their key objectives and strategy. I think sometimes this is the poor relation of things such as funding and investment, but clearly it's very important to members. The final issue I want to cover before handing over to Grant is skills and experience. Just as with the running of any organisation, it really is fundamental to the good running of a scheme that the trustee board as a whole have the right skills and experience. And my experience is that traditionally, this hasn't always been the best managed area, where there being room for improvement in how trustees and employers work together to ensure the scheme has the best equipped trustee board it can have. Pensions regulators also encouraging trustees and employers to consider the diversity of trustee boards in terms such as areas of age, gender, and race. And greater diversity can obviously bring different skills, different perspectives and approaches to issues, and overall improve trustee board effectiveness. Although I do recognise that for some schemes, in fact probably for many schemes, there is a challenge for trustees and employers, as they will be limited by the ability and willingness of individuals to serve as trustees. In terms of legal requirements on skills and experience, trustees have a legal duty within 6 months of being appointed to do two things. Firstly, they must have a knowledge and understanding of pensions and trust law, the principles of scheme funding and investment, to enable him or her to properly exercise their trustee functions. And secondly, they must be familiar with the scheme's rules, administration policies, and statements of funding and investment principles. Now, for large schemes, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, which requirement is getting expanded. So trustees of larger schemes are also going to be required to have a knowledge and understanding of the principles relating to the identification, assessment and management of risks and opportunities relating to climate change. So I know that's something that trustees of larger schemes are doing at the moment. On the knowledge and understanding front, the Pensions Regulators Toolkit, I think, is an excellent resource. Although on the scheme familiarity side, trustees are going to have to review and ideally get some training on the specifics of their own scheme. The Pension Regulator recommends that trustees individually and as a board carry out an annual assessment of the skills they need and whether there are any shortcomings. And importantly, these should involve soft skills. So, for example, how the trustee board communicates, how it negotiates. These are essential, really, to the running of a trustee board, as well as technical skills. Individual performance reviews by the chair of trustees can be helpful, as are upward reviews of the chair, him or herself. And where there are knowledge gaps, training plans should be put in place with a focus on matters in the scheme's business plan, which the trustees need to address. And the regulators indicated that for lay trustees, they should be aiming to undertake around 15 hours of learning each year, which may, I think, be a considerable increase for some trustees. And at that stage, I will now hand over to Grant.
Thanks, Andrew. So turning to trustee meetings in a virtual world. The agendas of trustee meetings set the tone, pace, and success of effective meetings. We've seen a move to changing the order of the agenda, starting first with strategic matters that require discussion and decision, then moving later to operational items, which also need to be covered. Following this model means strategy gets prioritized at meetings and sufficient time set aside at the start to focus on strategy rather than get caught up early on in the detail. It also means that important strategic matters are discussed whilst attendees are feeling energetic and fresh rather than tired later on in meetings. Having covered strategic and operational items, any time remaining can cover questions on items for noting. Meeting papers that have been circulated in advance and do not require a decision can be included in the items for noting section, taken as read unless trustees have any questions. This way, a lot more content is covered whilst not unnecessarily repeated at meetings. Objective meetings and decisions required should be defined at the start and then checked back in at the end of the meeting to ensure they've been achieved. Good governance at meetings themselves is about avoiding groupthink and willful blindness, and really increasing the diversity of the boards, as Andrew referred to earlier, and appointing someone to play devil's advocate or bad cop in a meeting to challenge should help with that. To share an example, one of my boards was spending too much time on operational business as usual with a lengthy 6-hour meeting. We revised the agenda, so more focus was on strategy at the start, with operational items covered separately within subcommittees or offline between meetings, and that brought the meeting time down by a third. In our post-vaccination world, we can see some trustee meetings returning to in-person, whilst others remain online. Some topics are much better suited to in-person meetings, such as training, strategy, and long-term planning, where debates and ideas can flow and questions can be asked without restricted by the cries of, "You're on mute." Chairs and advisors can read the room if you're there in person to see if there's sufficient understanding of the topic being discussed by all trustees, particularly where it's more complex. Better outcomes are likely to be achieved when discussions take place collaboratively in the same room. For those meetings that stay online as video conferencing, it's helpful for the chair to give a reminder at the start of the meeting on the rules of engagement, particularly if there are many trustees or attendees. Starting with asking participants to use the mute function when not speaking, raising hands visually or using the raise hand function. This ensures questions are spotted and raised without cutting across others. And consider utilising a 5-second rule, where chairs ask for any objections to the summarised decision, otherwise silence is taken as consent by the trustees. This avoids the need for unmuting and muting at regular intervals. Turning to advisors. Good advisors support and guide the trustee, employer and members so they can make informed decisions about complex pension matters. Papers and emails need to be short and focused, with clear recommendations via an executive summary at the start of the paper. The details supporting the recommendation can follow in the paper behind it. Meeting packs need to be shorter to enable trustees to see the wood through the trees. Papers need to be on time and sufficiently in advance of when they will be considered and discussed. Advisors also need to be very specific when they come to meetings. What is the decision required and the recommendation? Advisors need to be realistic about the time needed and the time available to them in trustee meetings. As well as having standard service contracts in place with trustee advisors, it's important that trustees set advisors specific objectives and then monitor and review those regularly. Last year, the bar was raised on this with CMA compliance statements requiring investment objectives to be set for consultants. At Ross Trustees, we set these objectives in 5 areas: strategy, monitoring, compliance, regulation, member engagement, and communication. The framework of these existing objectives could be extended to cover all advisors, in particular actuarial and covenant, in an integrated risk management way. The best trustee boards have a strong, joined-up set of advisors working with them in a collaborative way, where the advisors work together to help trustees solve problems, not competing for space or more work, where ideas are shared but not sold. Advisors need to be involved too, otherwise how can they help? An example of undergovernance I've seen can be legal advisors not coming to any meetings or not seeing meeting packs to keep costs down. In either scenario, how do your legal advisors know what's going on? How can they spot any risks or points that need to be raised by the trustees? Objectives set for advisors should be consistent with the trustee board objectives. It's good governance to have a set of objectives in place for the trustee board and then bring everything that the board and their advisors do back to those objectives. If a particular project is not going to help the trustees achieve an objective, why are the advisors recommending it? To share an example, one of my boards compiles a trustee achievements this year every December. What did we as trustees really achieve in terms of tangible outputs for the scheme and our members? We ask advisors to state what the scheme's achieved in each of their areas, which the trustees then review and supplement. The aim is to both reflect on the year just gone and to set the objectives for the following year. It's important to have a process in place to review your advisors, say every 3 to 5 years. Reviews can be proportionate to the needs of your scheme. For example, light touch if you're happy with your advisors, or more in depth if you have concerns or wish to test the market for value for money. Turning to risk. Good governance is centered around managing risk, having appropriate internal controls, risk management and risk monitoring tools in place to manage, mitigate and reduce risk. Focusing on the key risks, say the top 5, that trustees have identified by scoring on their risk register in terms of impact and likelihood. Risk registers should be more than a tick box exercise. They need to be actively used. They can be extensive and timely to work through, so dividing into 5 or 6 areas and tackling one area at a time at each meeting can help. We're also seeing the focus turn, as Andrew alluded to earlier, to managing other risks such as climate related. We saw how active risk registers could help when COVID-19 struck. At Ross Trustees, we had a COVID-19 specific risk register in place for our schemes to cover each of the areas for this unplanned event. First and foremost, checking that providers and in-house teams were set up so they could work from home and manage payroll, so pensions would continue to get paid to members, which thankfully they were. Secondly, would employers need to request to defer deficit contributions so they could remain solvent? Some of our schemes explored the option, though none were taken. Were investments safe and sufficiently diversified to reduce exposure to areas most impacted by the pandemic? As another example, some property funds might have gated and closed to withdrawals when disinvestments were needed by the trustees. So planning ahead and transferring funds early on helped in some of those cases. We saw complications arise where default funds were either gated or where moving these funds changed or created a default unintentionally. What we have seen over the last 2 and 3 years is a high level of hedging risks in investment strategy, much more evidence in place, which again helps protect trustees and their members. We saw schemes that had thought ahead and spent time contingency planning and had good governance in place to act quickly. In our experience, it was those schemes that tended to weather the pandemic with better outcomes than those who did not. Finally, in terms of risk management, spot potential conflicts of interest early on and head those off at the pass. For example, where employer-nominated trustees may need to abstain from voting or temporarily step away from discussions. Again, planning ahead should reduce the impact and enable boards to continue to move with agility. Turning to our members. Good governance should result in an enhance in the member experience to both DC and DB members, both in terms of the day-to-day, for example, requesting a retirement quotation, and in terms of outcomes, for example, what income at retirement a member receives. Regular, clear, concise, topical communication that's easy to understand is what our members need. Questions we hear from members, or that they should be asking, is, why are you telling me? What does this mean? What do I need to do? We're seeing a focus on communications in response to specific circumstances. So COVID-19 was one, scams has been another, and market volatility becoming more prevalent, making them relevant and timely for members. As well as keeping members informed, communications are a good way of finding out whether members have moved or moved on, ready for when you need it. Asking members for their email addresses helps stay in touch. An email address might change less than a member's address, and it gives trustees 2 ways of contacting members. The method of communicating with members is challenging, especially during the remote working environment. The market's playing catch-up in terms of technology supporting pension schemes and members, with some digitisation underway to help, for example, the pensions dashboard. More technology needs to be developed, and this in turn needs to be used by members. Take-up rates are typically low for members registering and then regularly logging on to self-service member portals. We think we'll see there be more investment in digital stuff going forward, especially, but not solely, in relation to DC members. Getting data in order is on the agenda for most schemes, considering what data is really needed for the end game for each scheme and for the projects along the way, and then having a plan to get to that data. Investment choice. Members desire choice and help with making that choice. More time and effort is being spent helping members with that in the DC space in terms of default funds, which is great, but less so for those members with additional voluntary contributions in DB schemes. These should of course be proportionate, but members need trustees to ensure that AVCs are sufficiently reviewed too. On the scams pledge, the regulators asked trustees and advisors to take the pledge to help members. We saw during COVID-19 scammers continue to target pension pots of all sizes, with members across the UK being tricked into handing over their pension savings. Trustees and advisors need to check, and check again, that members are sufficiently aware of the risks they run in transferring, particularly out of a DB scheme, and that members have received enough help to make an informed decision. Turning to professional trustees. Why are there being more accredited professional trustees being appointed? As employers focus on driving their businesses forward in the new world, and more lay trustees face increasingly competing demands on their time, we're seeing further support being sought from professional trustees, be that as a co-trustee, chair of trustee, or sole corporate trustee. In particular, member-nominated trustees are becoming harder to find, and an increasing number of scenarios are arising where the existing trustee board may become conflicted, for example, in the event of restructuring of an employer. The regulator continues to appoint professional trustees in circumstances, for example, when an employer becomes insolvent for a wind-up of a scheme, and where they don't feel that the trustee board as a whole doesn't have the necessary knowledge and skill to do the job that it's tasked with. The advantages of having a professional trustee. The appointment of a professional trustee can free up existing resource and help meet any skill gaps on existing boards. It can bring experience and independence from the employer at a time when conflicts are widespread. Such appointments of a professional trustee should lead to quicker, more efficient, agile decision-making that can take advantage of favourable market opportunities and achieve best results for members and employers. Back in 2019, the pensions regulator set out a required set of standards for professional trustees together with an associated accreditation process, stating that the regulator wanted to see good quality professional trustees with expertise and that well-governed pension schemes should achieve good outcome for members, benefiting employers and the economy as a whole. The standards are intended to improve and provide assurance on the quality of professional trustees and discourage poor practice in the market, setting out a range of governance and risk controls that sole trustee firms must adhere to in order to protect members' benefits. Previously, anyone could say they were a professional trustee. The desire is to have a minimum level of standard for all accredited professional trustees and for those appointing a professional trustee to understand what should be expected from them. More recently, with effect from 1st of January 2021, the Association of Professional Pension Trustees introduced a code of practice with new voluntary standards for professional corporate sole trustees, but is as applicable to any professional trustee appointment. The code sets out a number of principles, including appointing a professional trustee, ensuring due diligence process is followed, and that the decision and rationale of the appointment is recorded and communicated to the employer. Maintaining a sponsoring employer independence policy so that robust governance protocols are in place to ensure that professional trustees manage potential conflicts of interest effectively and they maintain independence and are seen to be independent from the employer. This is aimed at addressing concerns by some that a professional trustee is brought on board as someone who's employer-friendly to get over the line what the employer wants to achieve. Finally, documenting the decision process on how decisions are taken and recorded and not unduly influenced by outside commercial interests. This includes the appointment of our advisors based on the needs of the scheme and the merits of that particular advisor and firm, and not unduly influenced by business and personal relationships. Now passing back to Andrew.
Well, thank you for that, Grant. I hope that's given you all a good feel for how to go about ensuring that your scheme is well governed. As I said at the beginning, this is an area where the pensions regulator is taking a more hands-on approach. So I think all schemes should now be in a position or moving to a position where their arrangements are appropriate and up to date, and importantly documented. I think it's important that schemes can demonstrate to both the pensions regulator and to their members that they have those arrangements in place. So do make sure they're documented. So I'm going to pop us back onto camera now so that you can see myself and Grant and take a look at what questions we've got. So let me just have a look down in the our questions box to see what we've got. One for you, Grant. So there's a question about what should trustee boards do in terms of reviewing the trustee board? So not reviewing advisors, but reviewing the trustee board themselves to see how they are operating. So do you have any views on that, Grant, that you could share with the audience?
Sure. So building on what you alluded to earlier, Andrew, about the trustee board and having individual conversations. So what I see across trustee boards, and I do with mine, are to have individual one-to-ones with trustee directors at least once a year, as well as regular dialogue, just to ask on how it's going, feedback, are the advisors putting it at the right level for them to understand, how am I doing as chair? So have those conversations individually, and then collectively get together as a group to share those anonymized as to what the thoughts are and how we continue to strive for improved governance. And in fact, I've got a call post this session this morning to do that very thing with a trustee board I work with. I guess then that raises the question, who assesses the chair, right? How I've seen that work quite well on some of my schemes is it's a combination of the advisors, because actually you see trustees and chair of trustees day in, day out, and can bring your experience and challenge to a board, and I'm open to that. We're all capable of learning and improving further. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is, and we haven't seen this take off so much yet, but is, do we ask the members? We communicate a lot to members these days about what's going on the scheme. Should we be articulating more what the trustee board set out to achieve during the year and whether it achieved it or not, and then invite members to embrace the technology and use surveys? So I think there's more to come on how you collectively assess the effectiveness of a trustee board.
That's very helpful, Grant. Thank you for that. I can see we've got a number of questions. I've got another one for you, or I can see some that are perhaps more appropriate for me. Do you want to take another one, or do you want me to take one?
Let's give you back one in return, shall we? So one I've seen come in, Andrew, is you mentioned earlier on about the regulator's suggestion of 15 hours training being reasonable. Do you think that's reasonable and achievable for trustee boards?
Yeah, so I mean, this came out, I think it was over a year ago now, perhaps a year and a half ago, in the consultation which the regulator was having on governance in 21st century trusteeship. So I mean, I do think that's a reasonable figure, actually. I think if you're going to be doing a proper job as a trustee, whatever the size of the scheme, there's a lot going on in the pensions world. So I think that probably is an appropriate target. Possibly sounds high to some people, but I actually think the regulator is including reading pensions press and periodicals on that, attending things like this webinar. So I think if trustees just go to a number of webinars throughout the year, have some training from their own advisors, and maybe go to one of sort of the professional conferences, either in person or obviously at the moment virtually, that should enable them quite easily to get up to that 15-hour mark. So I mean, I think in my experience, most of the people that I deal with do that. I think it almost comes back to your first question on sort of trustee board reviews, that I think I will be asking, if I was a chair of trustees, to what extent are you as a member of the trustee board keeping yourself up to date with what's going on? So yes, I mean, it may at first blush appear a little bit high, but I think certainly over the course of a whole year, that is an appropriate standard. That'd be my view.
And I guess, Andrew, it's fair to say there are also learning on the job opportunities, aren't there, in terms of trustee boards and trustee meetings? Often when advisors are taking trustees through a decision, there's some training or learning in there. I guess every little helps in terms of the 10 or 15 minutes to be able to make those effective decisions. So I suspect some trustees are actually being trained more than they perhaps recognise or record, just basically doing the job.
I think that's probably right, Grant. I mean, I think we're both dealing with schemes that are now sort of looking at GMP equalisation, which is it's a very difficult area both for advisors and for trustees. So inevitably there'll be quite a bit of upskilling for trustees to understand what's going on. And so I would count that sort of stuff as training and towards that 15-hour threshold. So yes, I think you're right that trustees perhaps don't always record the training that you're getting because it's part of a trustee meeting. Anyway, importance keeps time. So I do have, I think, if I can give you one more question, Grant. A question from one of the delegates. What's your view as a professional trustee on good, less good governance? What are you seeing from your perspective?
And I guess to answer that, it is coupled with the caveat that different governance is appropriate for different schemes. So there will be those with different size, different budgets, different times and expertise, and at different places in their journey. So it's difficult to pinpoint what is good governance. I mean, ultimately, I think it comes down to three things, really. The first one and the foremost is ensuring the right benefits are paid to the right members at the right time. That is key, what we're all here to ensure. And the second is having the documentation in line to make sure that you're able to achieve that objective. So have you got all your latest trustee rules? Are what's being administered for the scheme actually in line with those rules, etc. And then the third one is that wider piece around trustee board effectiveness and what you're doing as a board, what we're doing as trustees, and how the objectives we're setting. So I think you can also, in terms of less good governance, there are other things to point out where the paperwork's not in place or people haven't taken advice, etc. I think for me, there's an example of you can overdo governance too. So I've certainly seen some trustee boards where they've ended up with a complicated investment strategy. And it is complicated, but probably more complicated than it needed to be. So actually, and then when they came up with the investment strategy and handed it over to a fiduciary manager to take care of the day-to-day, actually what happened is then the trustees couldn't quite let go and found themselves still dealing with the day-to-day operation all to themselves. So you can over govern with good intent and or be led to a scenario where perhaps you're doing more governance than's required. I almost look at it as kind of, as trustee boards, what's your intention and what's your capability and budget around governance? Is it governance with a little g to ensure you're compliant and do it in a proportionate way? Or is it governance with a big G, where actually you're really proud and want to be pioneering about leading the way, particularly on the larger schemes, about ensuring good governance for members?
That's very helpful. Thank you, Grant.
Excellent. Do we have time for one more, Andrew, so that you don't get let off the hook with another question?
I think we probably do have time for one more. Yes, go ahead, Grant.
So I think this one is sticking with a similar theme to what we've just been talking about, really. So what do you see, Andrew, as the major challenges to improving governance?
I think one of the challenges is really for those small to medium-sized schemes. So I think there is often a question of budget, also a question of resources in terms of I think time and appetite for addressing governance. So I think, as I've tried to make clear, and you have, Grant, throughout the talk, that there is governance needs to be proportionate. It needs to fit your scheme, but ultimately there is sort of there is a baseline which all schemes need to achieve. And I think it can be difficult, I think, for schemes where they've left their governance for a while. It can require a bit of effort to get things in place, but I mean, I would certainly encourage, I think, trustee boards who think their governance does need improving, but actually once you've gone through that step, and if you keep it up to date, it will actually make life easier for you. It will give a bit more structure to things. So again, in terms of things we've talked about, like reviewing the trustee board, planning for meetings, that will all help things go more smoothly. It will help trustees understand things they need to consider, what decisions they need to make, what advice they need to help them make that decision and get that in time. So I think it can be a little bit of a bit of reticence, say, oh, there's too much needs to be done. We'll continue to muddle on. I think also as well, as I mentioned a few times, governance isn't purely a matter for the trustees. People like employers, they're very much involved in the governance of schemes. They need to make decisions and feed into the scheme. So I think sometimes you can come across situations where the trustees are doing a good job, but actually the employer is not necessarily responding to the trustees in a timely way or giving them the information they need. So again, it's important, I think, that employers are properly resourced. So again, I think it's helpful for trustees and employers to sit down and talk about from time to time, how's the scheme working? Can we improve things? I suppose the last thing I'd say as well, I mean, things that I come across as well is perhaps you're dealing with trustee succession issues. Maybe the chair is wanting to step off the board. He or she has done her time, and again, that's something that needs to be thought through and planned with the employer well in advance of time, so there's a proper handover. So I think those things can be challenging if you suddenly get somebody saying, right, I'm leaving the trustee board in a month's time. That might be due to somebody having completed their term of office, or it might be there's changes on the employer side, especially at the moment with redundancies. Maybe you get a couple of trustees suddenly having to exit the trustee board. Now again, I think all those things need advanced planning and preparation. So yeah, an interesting area.
And Andrew, on that, I think it is the relationship between the trustee and the employer, I think, is key, as you identify, in terms of good governance. We're all in this together for the members and trying to sort out difficult, complicated pensions matters. So again, the more we could do to have that collaborative relationship at most times where possible, I think just helps with the governance and the right outcome for our members.
Indeed, yes. And I think it comes back to your communication point, Grant, that good communication all around is very, very helpful, very important. So I think we're coming up to time, so I am going to bring the webinar to a close now. I hope it's been helpful for you. And as I said, if you want to recap any issues or you want to share it with colleagues, it is available on the Field Fisher YouTube channel. And please do feel free to follow up with me or Grant if you've got any other specific questions. So thank you very much.